Newborns have a very keen sense of taste, smell, and touch, and they'll rely heavily on these senses to make, their explorations of their environment early in life. Uh, when it comes to the taste sense, they're very good at detecting differences between salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and they can even notice changes in their mother's breast milk. And it's quite common to see newborns with a sweet tooth. When it comes to smell, they're very good at detecting pleasant versus unpleasant odors and familiar smells from unfamiliar smells. You can see how they might use these kinds of sensory skills to try to identify individuals and identify different kinds of objects. And when it comes to touch, well, a lot of that also seems to have survival purpose. Like we talked in a previous video about the various patterns of like reflexes that newborns tend to demonstrate. Now, hearing and vision, those take a bit longer to develop, but babies do definitely have these sensory and perceptual skills. They're just still developing. So, like for example, fetuses can hear about 7 to 8 months after conception, and they will pay attention to different kinds of sounds. They're very sensitive to like speech sounds, for example. But obviously they're not as well developed as an adult. So hearing those pitches that are typical for human speech are relatively easy for them, but other things not so much. And they can also tell difference in certain speech sounds, which is interesting. It's like they come into this world prepared to recognize certain things about human speech. Like they can tell difference between like consonants and vowels, for example. And when it comes to music and like tone of voice and stuff like that, they generally prefer more pleasant, like melodic kind of sounds than harsher ones. And they do typically show signs of memory for certain kinds of songs and patterns of sound. So they do have plenty of skill even before birth, which will develop at a pretty rapid pace after they're born. Like by example, by about 4 months of age, most infants are able to recognize their own name, even though they don't know any language skills necessarily. They can recognize individual words like that. Vision, on the other hand, that takes a bit longer to develop. Newborns can see, but they are very, very poor when it comes to that visual capability. They can track an object, they can see a light, but that's about it. It isn't until they're about 1 month of age that they can start to see at a moderate distance. Like a 1 month old can see an object 20 feet away that an adult could see just as well 200 to 400 feet away. So you can see what I mean. They're virtually blind at birth, though they do have some capabilities. It isn't until they get to about 1 year of age that they have developed visual skills that are roughly equivalent to an adult. Their visual acuity is about the same. Visual acuity just refers to like the sharpness of perception. How far away can you see something clearly? But visual acuity isn't the only thing for the infant to need to develop over that first year. They're also developing their sense of color. Newborns typically can't perceive much color. It isn't until the first few months of their life that they start to really have that color vision system come online. And this involves the development of 3 different types of cells in the visual retina. We call these the different cone cells. So you have cones for red, cones for green, and cones for blue, and they, as I mentioned, are specializing in these first few months. It isn't until they're about 3 to 4 months that those cones are mostly in place and they can start to perceive colors in a similar way to an adult. Now, other kinds of vision besides just sharpness and color, other kinds of vision like depth, for example, that takes seemingly much longer. You know, these more complex kinds of vision seem to take much longer. So just to give you an example, by about 6 weeks, most infants will start to notice some depth cues. This is based on research we've done called visual cliff research. So if you put an infant, a 6-week-old infant, on what appears to be a cliff, it's not actually a cliff, but it looks like a cliff, they'll show some interest in that cliff. They won't seemingly understand the significance, but they certainly notice that something is different here. It isn't until they get older and they better learn those depth cues that they start to understand that this is actually a drop-off, and they will avoid going across that cliff. They'll show signs of, resistance, maybe even signs of fear in some cases, but that's typically not true. When infants are learning how to navigate their environment, they generally don't show much fear. By about 7 months of age, that's when they really start to show that fear. That's when they really start to show signs of an understanding that this drop-off means that they could get hurt. And that develops around the same time that they start to learn to crawl. But the ultimate goal of any sensation and perception is to try to recognize important objects in your environment. You want to be able to recognize things that are good for you and things that are bad for you. Avoid hazards and move towards your goals. So for perceiving objects, we need to take all these other visual skills and combine them. You need to be able to see clearly. You have to have that visual acuity. You have to see color. You have to see texture. You have to see depth. So it all comes together. But newborns obviously have severe difficulties at doing this because they haven't mastered those skills. Object perception is very limited. The only thing that newborns can really recognize clearly is really basic faces. They're pretty good at recognizing faces, but other kinds of things, it just takes them longer to learn. They have to start to learn some basic visual cues, such as common motion, common color, common texture, and aligned edges. So here's what I mean. One of the first things for a newborn to learn is this common motion. They learn that things that move together go together. In other words, if they were to see this, they would come to the conclusion that these are all part of a single object. So there must be an object shaped kind of like that over there, because they moved in a coordinated fashion. And then there's common color. The whole idea here is that the infant needs to learn that color matches go together. So if you look at this image, you'll see that there are some red points right here, and those most likely are all connected. Those are all part of a single red object. And then here's common texture. So they need to learn that texture matches go together. And if you look at these various textures, you'll notice that these over here seem quite similar. So they're probably part of a singular object, like a rectangular shaped object. And then finally, aligned edges. That's the final thing that I mentioned, where they need to learn that lines that apparently connect go together. So if you look at all these lines on the screen, you'll notice that some of them do in fact form a basic shape. Over here on the right, you have a stretched out looking pentagon shape. So those lines apparently seem to connect, so the infant would just assume. So that's the natural way that they try to understand the world, is by relying on these basic visual cues. But as I already mentioned, the first thing that they can recognize, the thing that they tend to show the most interested in at birth, is faces. Newborns prefer to look at faces, especially if those faces are moving. By about 4 weeks of age, that's when they start paying more attention to non-face things. By about 6 to 12 months, That's when they seemingly have developed enough memory to really understand what a face is and should look like. And they have, based that on their experience. So what I mean is, by about 6 to 12 months of age, if a child is exposed to a face unlike any they've ever seen, they'll react in surprise. Like this doesn't fit their preconceived ideas as to what a face could be. And it can be alarming to them. It can be very interesting to them. I've gotten that a lot from little kids myself. Like a lot of little kids, I guess they've never seen a beard before because they think I'm the weirdest looking person they've ever seen. But they refine that as they get older and they start to incorporate this new information. And it's around this same time, between 6 to 12 months or 7 to 8 months, that infants will start to understand faces holistically. It's not just a bunch of little features, it's how those features all come together. And that's exactly how adults do it as well. We take the big picture into account without breaking it down. It's a unique arrangement of features. Now, besides, just making sense of the environment and the external world using the various senses, these newborns are also learning to make sense of themselves, their internal environment. Is what we call the self-concept. Most children don't really show much understanding of the self until they're close to about 2 years of age. Their degree of self-awareness seems to be pretty much non-existent until they're about 2 years of age, approximately. And there are ways you can test to see if your infant has some self-awareness. Like, for example, an infant who is self-aware will tend to prefer looking at pictures of themselves more than pictures of other people. Also, if they show, if they refer to themselves by name or use personal pronouns, that's another sign that they have some self-awareness. If they show some signs of ownership, like if they grab things and say, "This is mine," or "That's yours," if they say stuff like that, that's another sign. But the easiest way to tell if a child or an animal has self-awareness is to do what we call the mirror test. So the mirror test is something developed by Gordon Gallup Jr. in 1970. It tests for self-awareness by trying to determine if a subject can recognize the image in a mirror as a reflection of itself. And typically this is done by placing a mark on the animal or infant's face and then seeing if they try to remove it. So it works just like this. You take your little baby or your little kitty or dolphin or whatever, you could do it with any animal, but you take the animal and you put like a little smudge on their forehead in a place that they couldn't possibly see unless they use a mirror. Then you put them in front of a mirror. And if they just look at the mirror and don't react, or if they don't show any interest in the mirror, then they have failed the test. To show self-awareness, what you would expect them to do is like reach for it and try to wipe it off. And it's really interesting. Like if you do this with a 1-year-old, they're probably going to fail. If you do it with a 2-year-old, they're probably going to pass. So there's a transformation occurring during that second year of life where the individual begins to understand that they are a unique individual. They are a self, and they can see themselves in a way that other people might. Like they start to develop that kind of, awareness of what other people might be thinking. But this is a very basic kind of self-awareness at this point. There's degrees to this self-awareness, and this is at its beginning. But I mentioned you could do this with other animals, and many animals have passed. Like some birds have passed, I think. I don't remember actually, but I know dolphins have passed, and many primates have passed. But most other animals don't. Dogs never pass the test. Cats never pass the test. A lot of animals you might think are intelligent, they just don't seem to have this self-awareness. And that's pretty interesting. So self-awareness does seem to be related to intelligence, but they're not like connected all that strongly, if that makes any sense. But all this discussion of self-awareness and understanding the self, this development that occurs during this second year of life, This brings us to what's called the theory of mind. Those ideas that the child starts to develop about connections between their own thoughts, beliefs, and intentions and the behaviors they engage in to create that kind of intuitive understanding between this link between the child's mind and the child's behavior. And as I said, it develops in phases. There's different degrees of self-awareness. By about 2 years of age, as I mentioned previously, that's when most children will show some basic signs of self-awareness. They'll talk about their own desires. They'll talk about themselves. They'll show an interest in themselves in mirrors and photographs and stuff like that. But by around 3 years of age, that's when they show a deeper sign of self-awareness. That's when they start to understand that their thoughts are disconnected from the rest of the world. If they thought it, if they felt it, that doesn't mean anybody else did. They understand that separation. So they're further separating themselves from the rest of the world. And then by about 4 years of age, that's when they start to gain a better understanding of why they have these thoughts they do. They start to understand that thoughts and beliefs and feelings are the result of experience. So they will start to understand that people's thoughts could be wrong. People can be mistaken. People can lie. They understand that reality can be deceiving.